All right, we're good to go. If you're listening online, thank you for being with us. Woo. All right. Well, thank you for coming. It's really, I've just been reflecting this afternoon on my gratitude for people who are doing this work. My research coming into looking at survivors of violent crime started in the area of homelessness. And I met so many young men and older men for whom every system had broken down. And who I wish had access to people like you that are doing the work you're doing. So thank you. We're going to talk a little on the other side about the experiences of service providers who are working with victims and survivors of crime. Diana and I are coming from the Victimology Research Center at Algonquin College, and we'll jump in. I'm going to tell you a bit about the research. Diana will talk about our themes, and then we'll conclude. Thank you, that's kind. Okay, so we've done a study during COVID of the experiences of well-being of service providers across the country who are working with men and women and gender diverse people who've experienced violent crime. The methods, I'll just give you a snapshot. We worked really extensively with consultations to develop a survey and got input from Statistics Canada and the Department of Justice. And we worked with the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Victims of Crime. And we were able to kind of design something that we felt could go across Canada and provide some valuable input on what was happening in victim services, the organizational structures, the well-being of the workers. And it just happened to end up that once we were delivering it, that COVID had kind of changed the landscape. So we held a research conference and conducted some focus groups with service providers. We did an online survey that we sent out across Canada. We have 915 responses from service providers. And then we've done 24 more in-depth interviews to dig into the themes and give us some rich qualitative content.
You want to keep talking? Okay, so as Ben said, we had this huge study with 914 participants. So today we'll be talking about a subset of that, folks who identified as being men working in this field. 6%, so 59 of 914 identified as male. And I found that does match government statistics for representation of males working in other helping fields like education and healthcare. And interestingly, when we were looking at reasons why this might be, one of our RAs pointed out that there's been a push for young women and girls to get into the STEM field, the science, tech, engineering, and math, without an equivalent push to encourage young men and boys to get into these helping fields. So that could partially explain why the numbers are so low. So we heard from men across all different types of sectors: police-based, community-based, court-based, victim services. And then I have some stats over here. 59 worked in non-government organizations and 37 have to work a second job. For those of you who are familiar with the geography of Canada, the map is shaded in to illustrate how many people we heard from each province, but we did hear from folks from all provinces and territories, which was great, a great representative sample across Canada. The next slide, please. Thanks. So just a quick snapshot of responses to the survey. We had an open-ended question where folks could check off all that apply on reasons why they entered this field. So for people who identified as male, 13 told us that they entered the field because they had been a victim or survivor of crime. 13 told us that they entered the field because someone they knew was a victim or survivor of crime. And 50 told us they entered this field because they wanted to help people. And then as a snapshot of the types of roles people do, 59% are in a managerial or supervisory role. 67 are required to be on call outside of their working hours. 62% are required to work overtime or more than full-time hours. 66% work full-time paid. 17% work part-time paid, and 14% are volunteers, so they're unpaid. One of the scales that we had, this was a massive survey. So we pulled out just kind of things that reflect on men and masculinities. So we had a question where people could talk about their experiences of microaggressions in the workplace. So I just want to draw your attention more specifically to sexual orientation, which is here, gender identity, which is here, and sexism. So a good handful, not a good handful, but like we did hear from folks who experienced or witnessed others experiencing types of microaggressions due to those factors. And this was our end for this number was 58. 58. One person skipped that question. But just to demonstrate that men do experience this in the workplace. Oh, can you do the next slide? Thanks. And then another section of our survey, we had what's called the Vicarious Resilience Scale, which is a really helpful self-assessment tool for folks to go through and check off different ways that they've experienced change as a result of an experience that they had. So I pulled out two factors here, 26 and 27, that both speak to the way that a person's intersectionalities influence their role. So their ethnicity, gender, class, sexual orientation, and religion affect power and privilege in a person's life and in my role as a helper. So that's 26. And 27 is I'm more aware of how privilege and marginalization connected to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and religion can affect a person's access to resources for overcoming adversity. So in this scale, folks can choose from 1 to 6, did not experience this, is 1, to experience to a great degree on the other end. And if I draw your attention to the far to right columns there, I don't know if I can. Oh no, what did I do? I killed it. Oh, I have to fold it. Okay, so could have just had that point. So if you look to this section, you'll just see that these are the biggest numbers. So most folks chose that they either experience it to a great degree or a very great degree. So just again, emphasizing the reflection that men put on their role and how it affects the work that they do. Next slide. And then we also had the opportunity to delve into masculinities more in a more targeted way through interviews. So we had 5 men who participated in follow-up interviews from all different sectors. Again, advocacy organizations and police-based victim services were the 2 most common. 2 of the participants had worked in the field for over 25 years, and then the others had less than 5 years. So a good range of amount of experience that folks had. And then, as I said, we got to really delve into the role of masculinities because we had a semi-structured interview schedule that allowed our RAs to really ask questions and follow-up questions that helped our participants reflect on the role of gender in their work. So even though we had a small sample, there were still some really interesting reflections that men had. So I pulled out some quotes. I'll just leave them here because I'll read them really fast probably, but maybe I'll just summarize. So one person talked about in the top there, the impact on parenting and fatherhood. He reflected on how if you work in a field where you're doing manual heavy lifting, an inevitable side effect is you're going to develop stronger muscles. Like it's not your goal, but that's what's going to happen. And so for him, working in this field and developing his empathy, he reflected on how it made him a better partner and a better father because he was bringing that strength from his work into his personal life. So that was a really interesting perspective to hear. And then another person talked about how there's this perception that men in this field shouldn't be demonstrating vulnerability. So if he's showing himself at work in a stoic way, other people might perceive him as not struggling or not having difficulties because he's not talking about it. So people just assume that he doesn't have these same struggles that his coworkers have. And then 2 different other participants reflected on being a male in victim services when the clients that they serve would prefer to speak to a man. And they both talked about how, like the quote at the bottom, especially some men, some of the clients prefer, for whatever reason, to have a male staff to talk to. And the first quote there talking about how they work almost exclusively with men. So even though there are women on their staff, they feel like there are clients who would prefer to speak to a man. So these two both talked about the benefit of being a man in this position. Next slide, please. Oh, no, I think we missed one. And then we also heard from a man who works as a supervisor in the field, and he reflected on how it kind of created almost a barrier for him because he felt like he had to maintain a professional distance and not maybe interact with some of his female subordinates the same way that he thought maybe a female supervisor might be able to. So that was an interesting perspective for me to hear. It never even occurred to me I know when I have worked in male dominated fields, I've changed the way that I act, and it never even occurred to me that someone else might do that until he said it. So I was really thankful that he shared that perspective. It was really, oh, Joe, I can read the whole thing. Yes, for sure. So he said, but I will say, as a male working in a largely female dominated profession and being sometimes the guy at the top, I probably approached things sometimes a little more hands off. Part of the way I treated staff was very deliberate. I was very deliberate with the things I said, things I wouldn't say, just because, I wanted to be respectful. And I'm not sure that my female counterparts they probably would have been more, sometimes I felt they'd be more friendly and open with staff than maybe I was. And then the final kind of thought that somebody shared that I thought was interesting was this person worked in an environment with potentially volatile clients. And he spoke to how he would observe maybe angry clients and how they would interact with female staff being verbally assaultive in a way that they wouldn't do that with him because he's a man and he didn't think that people treated him that way. So it was really interesting, just kind of halfway through the quote, he says, it's very real that I've seen the women that are staff that are targeted, sometimes really vicious, mostly verbal assault, even daily, that women can be the victims of this workplace. So I've seen that, and the clients don't do that with the men's staff so much, which I thought was an interesting reflection. And then just kind of to wrap up some concluding thoughts, that we know that men are conscious of working in female-dominated fields, and that men alter their behavior based on assumptions of masculinities, like the gentleman who changed his supervisory behavior, or the one who didn't appear vulnerable even though he felt vulnerable. And that men in these roles are fathers and caregivers, and this work impacts those relationships. So for some implications going forward, we need to acknowledge the gender imbalance in this victim service field and recognize the impact that this type of work has on parenting, fatherhood, and partnerships in your personal life. And there's work to do to better understand these roles.
Thank you, Diana. Fantastic. I just wanted to reiterate, I'm quite interested in this impact on fatherhood of working in a field that's responding to violence, and how it intersects with masculinities around sometimes protector roles, provider roles. And when men come home, we know that for folks who are working with children who are abused, that often it's difficult to kind of reconcile how that could happen to other children, and it can really affect you when you think about your own children. And I think that often we think of that more through the role of mothers. So I think there's some room to explore what it's like for fathers specifically, and in that gendered role. So this is kind of an early snapshot of what we were hearing from men in the study. We have a lot of data on well-being, how organizational structures affect the well-being of staff, some things that are going to be generally helpful to organizations and structures that are working in this field. But we wanted to highlight some of these pieces that we were hearing specifically from men. I think finally, I could, talking and listening to these guys, I could really identify with some pieces around, particularly one of the participants talked about being that supervisor in victim services with a predominantly female staff team, and thinking about how there were limits to the level of support that he could offer his female staff, saying, I think, another female supervisor might do debriefing and, the trauma unloading a little differently than what I can offer, being conscious of those gender differences and expectations for what a professional relationship looked like. I think there's lots to explore in here, and this is kind of our early start. So thank you, and we have lots of time.